I had a close friend and mentor who's now in heaven. His name was Ronald Morrison, and he was parish minister in Alness for about 20 years until his very sudden passing in 2013. When I was 17, Ronald would meet up with me every second week to talk about life and talk about ministry. When I went to university and then the Free Church College, he would write me, email me, phone me on a regular basis. Whenever I returned home for the holidays, he would arrange to meet up with me. When I was inducted to Thurso, he preached at my very first service. And at one point, Ronald encouraged us to read a book on prayer by a Norwegian pastor named Ole Hallesby. And here's what Hallesby says about prayer. To pray is nothing more than to let Jesus into our needs. To pray is to give Jesus permission to employ his powers in the alleviation of our distress. To pray is to let Jesus glorify his name in the midst of our needs. The results of prayer are therefore not dependent upon the power of the one who prays. Our intense will, our fervent emotions, or our clear comprehension of what we are praying for are not the reasons why our prayers will be heard and answered. Nay, God be praised. The results of prayer are not dependent upon these things. To pray is nothing more involved than to open the door, giving Jesus access to our needs and permitting him to exercise his own power in dealing with them. This evening, we're going to begin a short series. I'm one of these people, I always have to be in a series. I can't do one-off sermons, otherwise I get myself completely confused. So we're going to begin a short series on people who prayed. People who prayed. And I want us this evening to look at Abram's prayer for Sodom. And we'll divide the passage under two headings, the decision and then the discussion. The decision and the discussion. First we have the decision, and you see that in verses 16 to 22, where the author focuses on the Lord's decision to go down to Sodom. In verse 16 we see the rising. We can begin by noting what has taken place in verses 1 to 15. The Lord, along with two men, has appeared to Abram at the oaks of Mamre in Hebron, and Abram has treated them as honored guests and hastily prepared a meal for them. The Lord has then promised Abram that he will return within a year, and within that time, Abram and his elderly wife Sarah will have a son. And we can now see what takes place following on from this. In verse 16, we're told that the men rose or set out from there. We're told that they looked towards Sodom, the city that Abram's nephew Lot had chosen to reside back in Genesis 13. And we're told that Abram went with them and sent them on their way. Abram quite literally walks with God. We move from the rising to the resolution in verses 17 to 19. We hear the rhetorical question. Look at verse 17. The Lord speaks. It's unclear if he's speaking to himself or if he's speaking to those around him. And he asks the question, shall I hide from Abram what I am about to do? It's a rhetorical question since the Lord has already resolved that he is going to reveal to Abram what he's about to do. And we hear the Lord's reason for doing so. Look at verses 18 and 19. The Lord is going to reveal to Abram what he's about to do, since Abram is going to become a great and mighty nation, and all the families of the earth will be blessed in him. Furthermore, the Lord is going to reveal to Abram what he's about to do, since he has chosen Abram, known Abram, been intimately acquainted with Abram. And he has chosen Abram, he says, so that Abram might command his children and household to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice. And by doing so, the Lord will bring to Abram what he had promised to him. The Lord has resolved to allow Abram to be privy into his plans, into his purposes, because he has a high regard for Abram. And not only does he have this high regard for Abram, but he also has a high calling for Abram. We move, though, from that resolution to the revelation in verse 20 and 21. The Lord tells Abram about the information that he has received. Look at verse 20. A great outcry against the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah has reached him. The Lord is in receipt of a legal complaint against these two cities. And the outcry has come because the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah is grave, it is great, it is grievous, it is weighty, it is heavy. Now that should really come as no surprise to the readers of this narrative, because back in Genesis 13, the author has told us that the men of Sodom were wicked, and they weren't simply wicked, they were great sinners before the Lord. And the Lord goes on to tell Abram about the investigation that he is now going to conduct in verse 21. He is going to go down to Sodom, and he will see whether they have done according to all the outcry that has come to him. And if not, if they haven't done all the wickedness that has been reported to him, if they aren't as bad as has been made out, then the Lord says he will know. Now, the Lord is a God who knows all things. But here he's emphasizing to Abram that he's going to conduct a careful investigation, a thorough investigation into these cities before he takes any further action. We move from the revelation, though, to the reaction in verse 22. Let's recap on what has just happened. The Lord has spoken to Abram and given him information about what he intends to do. He has told Abram that he is in receipt of a complaint against the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah because of their wickedness. And he's told Abram that it's his intention to go down to these cities and conduct an investigation to see if they're as bad, if they're as wicked, if they're as sinful as has been made out. And we see what now happens. Verse 22, the two men who are with Abram and the Lord turn away, and they proceed to make their way to Sodom. Meanwhile, Abram still stands before the Lord. It's a significant moment. Abram stands ready and willing to make a desperate appeal to the Lord on behalf of Sodom and Gomorrah. Abram stands ready to act as intercessor, advocate, man in prayer for the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, these wicked cities. Now, friends, as we consider these verses, we're being shown the invitation to God's servant. To God's servant. That's what we see here in Genesis 18. Here's the Lord, and he's telling Abram about what he has heard and what he intends to do. And here's Abram now choosing to stand before the Lord, choosing to intercede before the Lord. Listen to how Dale Ralph Davis explains what's taking place. He writes this: "It seems to me that the statements in verses 20 and 21 have glue all over them. These verses don't merely communicate information, but they act as an invitation. It's as if the Lord is saying to Abram, now please talk to me about this situation. And Abram does. Abram goes on standing before the Lord. And friends, that's important for us to reflect on tonight. The Lord is a God who invites his people, draws his people, nudges his people, prods and prompts his people to pray, to speak to him. Did you ever stop to think about that? Dale Ralph Davis illustrates this with a story about the evangelist Duncan Campbell and Mary Morrison, who was from Lewis. It was 1957, and Duncan Campbell was preaching in South Africa. And on one particular afternoon, Mary Morrison, who was back here in Lewis, felt this great urge, this great compulsion to pray for Duncan Campbell. She went away, she prayed for the evangelist, and then she wrote to him asking if everything was all right, and noting the day and noting the time. And it turned out at the exact moment when Mary Morrison felt that compulsion, that urge to pray, that Duncan Campbell had been preaching in Pretoria. And as he'd been preaching, he'd suffered a severe hemorrhage that had resulted in him being taken to hospital. Mary Morrison was 6,000 miles away from South Africa, living in Lewis, and yet she felt that compulsion, that urge, that prod, that prompt to pray. And the Lord still invites his people to pray, still nudges his people to pray, still prods and prompts his people to pray. Maybe it's those nights when you wake up and it's 3 or 4 in the morning and you've got someone's name on your mind, they're on your heart, or maybe you've just been dreaming about them. It's a prompt to pray, isn't it? Or maybe it's those moments when a friend calls around and that friend tells you about some difficulty they're going through, some dilemma they're experiencing, some distress that they're feeling. Again, friends, it's a prompt to pray. Or maybe it's when you hear about the Lord's work going on in some part of the world, or some part of the country, or some part of the island, or even some part of this district. It's a prompt to pray. Or maybe it's those moments when you put on the news, you put on the 6 o'clock news, the 10 o'clock news, and you see all the trouble and all the chaos and all the confusion going on locally, nationally, or internationally. Again, it's a prompt to pray. The Lord has many ways, he has many means of prompting his people, nudging his people, prodding his people, encouraging his people, inviting his people to pray. So this evening I want to ask the question, how are you responding to the Lord's promptings? How are you responding to the Lord's nudgings? Are they driving you like Abram to that place of prayer, that place of standing before the Lord? But we move from the decision to the discussion in verses 23 to 33, where the author focuses now on the Lord's discussion with Abram. In verses 23 and 26, we hear the strong plea. We hear the request that Abram makes in verses 23 to 25. Abram's been standing before the Lord, and look at what it says. He now draws near to the Lord, and he asks, "Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked?" And he then raises the hypothetical scenario of 50 righteous people somehow being found in the wicked city of Sodom. And he asks if the Lord will sweep away the city or spare it for the sake of those 50 righteous people. Now that word spare is interesting. It can mean to forgive, but it can also mean to show favor. And Abram probably has both meanings in mind as he says to the Lord, "Will you forgive that wicked city for the sake of 50 righteous people? Will you show favor to that wicked city for the sake of 50 righteous people?" And he then says that it's impossible for him to comprehend the Lord sweeping away the righteous with the wicked, the righteous sharing in the fate of the wicked. "Far be it from you," he says to the Lord, "for you to do such a thing." And he closes by asking, "Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just?" Abram affirms the fact that the Lord is ruling. He is the judge of all the earth. And he affirms the fact that the Lord is righteous. He does what is just. And having heard Abram's request, we hear the Lord's response. Look at verse 26. The Lord speaks to Abram, and he assures him that he will spare the whole city. He will forgive Sodom, show favor to Sodom if 50 righteous people are found in it. It's a breathtaking response, isn't it, to Abram's strong plea. But we move from the strong plea to the successive proposals, verses 27 to 32. We see the first proposal, verse 27 and 28. Abram acknowledges now that he is dust and ashes. He sees himself as nothing, sees himself as a nobody, and he asks if the Lord will destroy the city if 5 less than 50 righteous people are found in it. And the Lord addresses him and assures him that he will not destroy the city if 45 righteous people are found. We see the second proposal. Look at verse 29. Having heard the Lord's answer, Abram now asks the Lord if he will not destroy the city if 40 righteous people are found in it. And the Lord assures him that he will not destroy the city if he finds 40 righteous people. We see the third proposal. Look at verse 30. Abram grows bolder still. But you can see at the same time he's still trembling, he's still timid, he's still fearful, and he asks the Lord not to be angry with him. And he now asks if the Lord will not destroy the city if 30 righteous people are found in it. And the Lord assures him that he will not destroy the city if he finds 30 righteous people. We see the fourth proposal. Look at verse 31. Abram grows bolder still and asks if the Lord will not destroy the city if he finds 20 righteous people. And again, the Lord assures him that he will not destroy the city if he finds those 20 righteous people. And then we see the fifth and final proposal, verse 32. Abram asks the Lord not to be angry with him. And he says that he wants to speak just once more. And he asks if the Lord will not destroy the city if he finds 10 righteous people. He's gone all the way from 50 to 10, and the Lord assures him that he will not destroy the city if he finds even 10 righteous people in it. We move from the successive proposals to the solemn parting in verse 33. We're told that the Lord went his way. He's finished speaking with Abram. He's now going down to investigate Sodom, to see if what has been said about Sodom and against Sodom is true. And we're told that Abram returned to his place. He's finished speaking with the Lord. He goes back to the oaks at Mamre and Hebron. Now, there's nothing more that Abram can do for Sodom. There is nothing more that he can say for Sodom. There is nothing more that he can pray for Sodom. Now, friends, as we consider these verses, we're not just shown the invitation to God's servant, we're also shown the conviction of God's servant. That's what we see here in Genesis 18. Here's Abram, and he's asking if the Lord will not sweep away the righteous with the wicked. It's unthinkable to him that the Lord would do such a thing. And it's unthinkable to him because Abram believes two things. He believes the Lord to be the judge of all the earth, the one who is ruling, and he believes the Lord to be the one who does what is right, who does what is just. Abram is a man who is convinced of the fact that the Lord is ruling, the Lord is righteous, and that he can never be charged with any wrongdoing, any injustice, any miscarriages of justice. And friends, that's very important for us to reflect on tonight. You see, if you ever have time to survey the ancient Near Eastern religious literature, the literature of the Canaanite gods and the surrounding areas' gods, you see that their gods were as weak and capricious as those who had made them. They were limited like their creators. They were capricious like their creators. They reflected, they mirrored those who had made them. There was no belief held out that any of the Canaanite gods were ruling over all things and were entirely righteous. It's so different to the God of Abram, the God of Genesis, the God of the Old Testament, the God of the Bible, the judge of all the earth who does what is right. Once again, quoting Dale Ralph Davis, he says this: Abram doesn't have all the answers, but can't you see the pillow that Abram rests upon? Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? That is Abram's anchor. Not that Abram or you will not face mystery, but there is always this fundamental clarity, this bedrock, that at the heart of all things stand righteousness and mercy. You can rest a pile of mysteries and dilemmas and even heartbreaks on the words of verse 25. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? You know, that was powerfully brought home to me a few months ago when I was visiting a friend in our congregation, a member of our congregation, and this friend, this woman, had had the rug pulled out from under her. Something had come into her life, into her experience, that had really turned her whole life, her whole world upside down. And she kept on telling me that the one certainty that she was holding on to in that particular season was the fact that the Lord is in control. And not just in control, but is good. That he does all things well. She didn't have all the answers. And she still doesn't have all the answers. But she was convinced of the truth, comforted by the truth, that the Lord is ruling and the Lord is righteous. Let me ask you this evening, friend, do you have this conviction? Do you know this comfort where you too can say that the Lord is ruling, he is in control, and he is also righteous? He does what is just. And that no matter what might be happening in your life, and no matter what might be happening in the world, and no matter what might be happening round about you, you know these two things. You are convicted and convinced of these two things. The Lord is ruling and the Lord is righteous. But as we consider these verses, we're not just shown the invitation to God's servant. We're not just shown the conviction of God's servant. We are also being shown the burden of God's servant. The burden of God's servant. That's again what we see here in Genesis 18. Here's Abram, and he's pleading with the Lord to spare Sodom. Isn't it interesting that he doesn't simply pray that the Lord will preserve Lot? That's how we might be tempted to read it, that the Lord is saying, please spare, please preserve Lot. But Abram doesn't pray that the Lord will preserve Lot. And he doesn't even pray that the Lord will preserve 50 righteous people or 40 righteous people or 30 righteous people or even 10 righteous people. No, he says, will you not spare the whole city? Ligon Duncan writes this: Abram had that burden for the people of Sodom, people with whom he had absolutely nothing in common, and only the love of God in his heart could have brought that burden on Abram. And friends, that's important again for us to reflect on. The Bible teaches that God takes absolutely no pleasure in the death of the wicked. And we see that on clearest display in the life of Jesus, God in the flesh. Do you remember how in John chapter 19, Jesus is confronted with the unbelief of Jerusalem? They have rejected his words. They have rejected his works. They have rejected his entire person. And Jesus doesn't call down fire from heaven on that wicked city. He doesn't say, I can't wait for that city to get their just deserts. Jesus weeps over Jerusalem and says, would that you, even you, had known on this day the things that make for peace, but now they're hidden from your eyes. For the days will come upon you when your enemies will set up a barricade around you and surround you and hem you in on every side and tear you down to the ground, you and your children within you, and they will not leave one stone upon you because you did not know the time of your visitation. Jesus says all these things, but he says it with tears in his eyes, burdened over the fate, burdened over the future, burdened over the lives of those in unbelieving Jerusalem. And you know, friends, we see something of that burden. We see something of that tearful concern in the lives of his people. People like Robert Murray McCheyne. Remember Robert Murray McCheyne, young pastor in 19th century Dundee, died at the age of 29. And on one occasion he said this: as I was walking in the fields, the thought came over me with almost overwhelming power that every one of my parish must soon be in heaven or hell. Oh, how I wished that I had a tongue like thunder, that I might make all hear, or that I had a frame like iron, that I might visit everyone and say, escape for thy life. And as we close tonight, friends, I want to ask the question, do Do we have such a burden? Do we have such a burden for the people whom we live with, the people whom we work with, the people whom we see in the supermarket, the people whom we meet at the football, at the fank, on the ferry? Do we have such a burden for the people with whom we may have many, many things in common, be able to share stories, reflections, memories in English, in Gaelic? And do we have such a burden for the people with whom we may have very little or maybe even nothing in common? Maybe that, as we call them, I'm one of them, one of those incomers. Do we have such a burden for those with whom we may have much in common and those with whom we may have very little, maybe nothing in common? Do we have a prayerful burden, friends, that they would be saved, that they would be spared, that they would know the favor and the forgiveness of the living God before the day of his appointed judgment? That's why we gather on a Wednesday night, isn't it? We don't come here out of ritual. We don't come out here out of habit. We don't come here to keep the Kirk session off our case, off our backs. We come because we have a burden that people would know the grace of God in Christ Jesus. So that's Abram's prayer for Sodom, and God willing, in a few weeks we'll return to look at the prayer life of another one of the Lord's people. Don Neil, would you lead us in prayer, please?